Millionaire bets $500, 0 cents K, to anyone who can touch his very aggressive dog. Then, a homeless girl walks in. The lights of the Elite Courage Summit burned white-hot against the glass arena at the center of the California Convention Hall. Built like a pressure chamber within a modern coliseum, the stage pulsed with engineered tension. Wealthy donors in tailored suits, corporate executives in heels and sharp glasses, and thrill-seekers with cameras strapped to their chests filled every tier of seating. Their murmurs rose and fell like an electrical current, half curiosity, half fear. At the center, beneath a solitary spotlight, stood Donovan Reese, tech mogul, eccentric millionaire, and self-proclaimed behavioral pioneer. His sharp suit shimmered under the lights, and his smile was that of a man who thought he had tamed chaos. He lifted a sleek wireless microphone and let the silence stretch long enough to set nerves twitching. $500,000, he said finally, his voice polished and cruel. To anyone brave or foolish enough to step inside and touch Blitz. Just 10 seconds of contact, that is all. A murmur rippled through the room. Some laughed nervously. Others leaned forward. Reese turned toward the armored enclosure behind him. It hissed open hydraulically, and 2 handlers appeared, clad in tactical gear, eyes hard behind visors. Between them stalked Blitz. The German Shepherd was enormous, taller than most dogs in his class, with a sheen of black fur marred by old scars that caught the light like silver streaks. Each mark told a story of violence, though no one knew how many were from others and how many were self-inflicted against cage bars and restraint harnesses. The handlers paused before the arena's transparent center. Blitz's muscles coiled like rope beneath his skin. Then, with an almost reverent silence, they removed his muzzle. Blitz did not bark. Instead, he issued a low, rumbling growl that reverberated through the glass itself. The crowd tensed. "He is the most aggressive protection canine in the United States," Reese declared. "Former military asset, dishonorably discharged after an incident in the field that resulted in a man's death. I took him in. I understand what makes creatures like this tick." Blitz began pacing, scanning the audience with an unblinking stare. The room felt colder somehow. "He does not follow orders," Reese added, his smile twisting. "He follows fear." The tension reached a breaking point when a former federal agent, trim, composed, battle-tested, stood from the third row and cautiously approached the outer glass. He moved like a predator himself, but even before he reached the line, Blitz lunged. With terrifying speed, the dog slammed his body into the reinforced glass. The entire panel shuddered under the impact. The agent staggered backward, clutching his arm, his training barely enough to steady him. A wave of gasps erupted from the audience. The threat was real. "No takers?" Reese taunted, savoring the moment. "Fear is honesty." Then, from the shadows at the back of the hall, a small figure stepped forward. She was barely 12, and she wore shoes several sizes too large. Her coat was threadbare, held together more by memory than stitching. Her hair was matted, her cheeks smudged with soot and wind, and in her hands she held something soft and gray. A piece of frayed cloth, folded carefully. The crowd turned. Whispers rose. Security looked confused. Reese raised an eyebrow. The girl, Mira, did not speak. She could not. Mute since birth, she walked forward without hesitation. Her eyes locked not on Reese, not on the crowd, but on Blitz. Reese chuckled into the microphone. "What's this? A street rat? Hoping for $500,000 to buy yourself a proper jacket?" A ripple of laughter, uneasy and awkward, moved through the audience, but Mira kept walking, unfazed, until she reached the safety boundary line. Her feet stopped right at the edge. One step more and she would enter Blitz's kill zone. She raised the cloth. Inside the enclosure, Blitz froze. Then, without warning, he exploded. A snarl ripped through the room like a grenade. Blitz lunged, teeth flashing, crashing into the glass with such violence that a nearby steel latch cracked and bent. The sound of breaking metal sent shudders through the seats. Blitz struck again and again. One of the side panels near the emergency maintenance door buckled. A metal plate slammed to the floor with a thunderous clang. Someone screamed. A woman clutched her partner's jacket and shouted for them to stop her. Another voice cried out, "Get her out of there!" A man fainted, but Mira did not move. Blitz snarled inches away, foam flecking his muzzle, his breath misting the air between them. Reese folded his arms, watching with a cruel grin. "Here comes your proof," he whispered. Then the emergency panel gave way. Blitz stepped through, free from his glass prison. Every breath in the room caught, and Mira raised the cloth again. What happened next silenced the world. Blitz charged forward with the force of a thunderclap, claws scraping against the floor as he closed the distance between him and the small girl. The crowd screamed, rising to their feet, security bracing for catastrophe. Mira stood motionless, the cloth trembling slightly in her hand. Then he stopped. Blitz froze just a few steps away, his body tense, quivering with restraint. The air thickened. No one dared breathe. The dog growled, but softer now, confused. His head tilted. His ears twitched at the wind brushing past the threadbare cloth. Mira did not flinch. Slowly, she knelt down and sat cross-legged on the cold ground. The fabric fluttered gently from her hand. She still said nothing. She only looked at him. Eyes steady, heart pounding, the silence between them thick with something ancient and invisible. Blitz lowered his head. His nose brushed the cloth. He sniffed once. Then again. The growl faded into a slow, uncertain whine. His gaze softened. The muscle beneath his fur no longer bristled. Step by cautious step he moved forward, no longer the weapon Donovan Reese had paraded before the world. The massive German shepherd lowered his body until his chest touched the floor. Then he laid his head at Mira's feet. His tail gave a single, slow thump. The entire hall exploded into gasps and stunned silence. Reese stood paralyzed behind the podium, face blank. Around him, cries of disbelief rose in waves. "What just happened? Did you see that? He laid down!" One woman covered her mouth, tears brimming in her eyes. Another dropped her phone in shock. Mira reached forward. With gentle fingers, she touched the fur behind Blitz's ears. He closed his eyes, letting out a long, shaky breath. Not a growl, not a warning, just surrender. For the first time, the audience understood this was not a miracle. This was memory. In the days that followed, the truth began to surface. The cloth, scientists confirmed, had an embedded scent marker of Blitz's earliest years. Worn into the fibers was saliva, traces of kibble, and natural oils that matched Blitz's DNA profile from a decade earlier. The cloth had belonged to Blitz during his time as a puppy, in the early days of his first shelter training. Mira, it turned out, had grown up in the same neighborhood as that shelter facility. Her family had lived in a trailer across the wooded field behind the building. Mira had been barely 4 years old when she discovered the lonely German shepherd puppy crying each night from a pen behind the center. Mute from birth, she could not speak to the dog, but she could listen. She had slid breadcrumbs and torn pieces of a blue cloth through the fence. She sang in her own way, tapping the bars with rhythm, humming quietly through her nose. When the facility closed down, Blitz was transferred to a harsher training site. Mira's family was evicted, they vanished from the records, and so did the cloth. Until today, in the middle of the world's coldest arena, two souls lost to time and trauma found each other again. No words, no explanations, just a single memory carried in scent and heart, and the monster the world feared, he had never forgotten kindness. The video spread like wildfire. Within hours, News outlets across the globe replayed the moment, frame by frame, of the ragged little girl sitting cross-legged before a dog the world had labeled danger incarnate. Headlines screamed, "The homeless girl who tamed the beast, $500, 0 cents K challenge ends in tears and redemption," and "Blitz lays down for kindness." Social media exploded. Millions watched, millions wept, and millions asked the same question: who is Mira, and who turned Blitz into this? Donovan Reese, once admired for his eccentric wealth and bold stunts, now found himself facing a wave of backlash. Journalists began peeling back the shiny surface of his so-called elite courage summit. Behind the scenes, it was revealed that Blitz had not merely been adopted, but was part of an underground behavioral experiment, a euphemism for brutal training intended to strip dogs of emotion, leaving only reaction and obedience to pain. The footage from Reese's private facility showed Blitz being subjected to isolation, hunger conditioning, and shock stimuli. There were reports, anonymous then verified, from former handlers who had walked away after refusing to participate. Some had tried to rescue Blitz and failed. Reese stood behind podiums, smiling nervously, trying to reframe the narrative. "I did not know the full extent of the prior training. Blitz came to me already broken," he said during an emergency press conference. "My challenge was meant to showcase courage, not cruelty," but the world was no longer interested in his excuses. Animal welfare organizations demanded full investigations. One prominent group, Guardians of the Voiceless, filed a formal petition for Blitz to be removed from Reese's custody and placed under protective care. Protesters gathered outside his estate with signs that read, "You made a monster, and Blitz deserved better." Through all of it, Mira remained quiet. She stayed in a foster shelter for the weekend, the same faded blue cloth folded carefully beside her. She asked for nothing, only one thing: to see Blitz again. When authorities came to seize Blitz for evaluation, Mira insisted on going too. "He knows me," she wrote on a whiteboard. "He will be scared without me." They allowed it. What happened next stunned even the most cynical officials. At the animal care facility, Blitz refused to exit the transport cage until Mira appeared. He whimpered, head pressed against the bars, unmoving, until her scent filled the air. Then he rose, calm, tail low but no longer stiff. He followed her into the assessment room like a shadow. That same evening, facing public scrutiny and mounting pressure from donors, Donovan Reese made a sudden announcement on live television. "I have made many mistakes," he began, his voice carefully composed. "But I am not a monster." He turned toward the cameras. "Effective immediately, I am surrendering custody of Blitz to Mira, his true companion, and I am donating $1 million to create a foundation for the rehabilitation of abused animals." The crowd watching on the screen erupted in applause. Some believed it was remorse. Others knew better. The move was calculated, a media maneuver designed to salvage his name, his brand, his legacy. But the money was real, and the life it would change, that of a silent girl and a once violent dog, was real too. Mira did not attend the broadcast. She was asleep in a warm room at the clinic. Blitz curled at her feet, the cloth between them like a fragile bridge to something long lost but finally found. For once, neither of them had to run. For the first time in her 12 years of life, Mira had a warm room with her name on the door. No cardboard for bedding, no alleyway noise to drown out fear. Just the quiet hum of safety. She had been taken in by Elena and Marcus Dawes, a kind couple who ran a sanctuary for animals and children who had been discarded by the world. Mira was both. Blitz, the German shepherd who once made entire crowds shiver behind bulletproof glass, now lay peacefully at the foot of Mira's bed. He never let her out of his sight. When she woke from nightmares, silent screams caught in her throat. He would press his head against her ribs until her breath slowed. She did not need to say thank you. Her hands did the speaking now. With the help of a therapist, Mira was introduced to American Sign Language. At first, it felt strange, talking with her fingers after years of silence. But she saw how quickly Blitz responded. He was more attuned to her than anyone else. When she signed friend, he would wag. When she signed scared, he would place a paw over her foot. Language was growing, not from her mouth, but from connection. Blitz, too, was learning a new way to be. Under the patient guidance of Marcus, he began training to become a certified therapy dog. The journey was slow, methodical. He had to pass tests for temperance, gentleness, and resilience under pressure. At first, even the sound of a dropped book would make him flinch. But then Mira would place her hand gently on his head and sign safe, and Blitz would breathe easier. Their bond became the foundation of his training. The day of his final evaluation, Blitz was placed in a room full of unpredictable stimuli, loud voices, quick-moving children, wheelchairs rattling over tile. He stood frozen for a moment. Then Mira entered. She did not speak. She did not sign. She simply stood still, holding that same old cloth he had once known, the one that reminded them both of who they used to be. Blitz walked to her side and sat. He passed with flying colors. From that day on, Mira and Blitz became something more than survivors. They became healers. Their first visit was to a pediatric cancer center. Mira wore a name badge that read, Mira and Blitz, Certified Comfort Team. She walked slowly down the hallway, Blitz beside her. In the corner, a little girl with a scarf tied tightly around her bald head sat staring out the window. She had not spoken in days, the nurses said. Mira sat beside her and laid the cloth on the girl's lap. The child giggled. Mira signed. Slowly, he's your friend now. The girl did not sign back, but she reached out her hand and stroked Blitz's fur. It was the first moment of connection she had made in weeks. This happened again and again. Shelters, clinics, recovery centers. Mira and Blitz visited places filled with invisible wounds, children with burns, bruises, and heartbreak. Blitz did not flinch. Mira did not speak. But what they offered was louder than words. Presence, trust, and love that expected nothing in return. The story of the girl who had no voice and the dog who was taught only fear became a symbol, not of tragedy, but of recovery. In each room they entered, broken eyes lit up. Mira had found her way to speak, and Blitz had learned to listen. Together, they began to heal the world, one quiet heart at a time. 1 year later, the auditorium pulsed with quiet reverence. People had gathered from across the country for the Hearts That Heal Gala, an annual ceremony honoring those who had changed lives not through fame, wealth, or speeches, but through presence, love, and silent resilience. At the center of the stage stood a girl in a soft blue dress, her dark hair falling neatly around her shoulders, her dark eyes patting the song Lily's ceiling, and the boy who stood her best. She was 12 now, no longer the nameless waif who had once stood trembling before a glass cage. Next to her sat Blitz, calm and regal, wearing a velvet blue vest with the words Certified Therapy Companion embroidered in silver thread. The spotlight bathed them both in gold. The host cleared his throat and said, "Tonight, we honor a girl who taught a so-called monster how to love, and in doing so, taught us what courage really looks like." Mira stepped forward. The room held its breath. She did not speak. She lifted her hands. In fluid, confident movements, she signed her message, her face radiant with expression. He did not need my voice. He needed someone to believe he was more than what they feared, and I did. Because I was, too. The interpreter behind her translated, but many eyes were already wet before a single word was heard. Applause thundered across the auditorium. Blitz let out a small huff and leaned gently against Mira's leg. She reached down and ran her hand over his head, their bond glowing like a quiet fire. Following the ceremony, it was announced that a new initiative would be launched in Mira's name, the Silent Bond Foundation. The foundation's mission was to identify and rehabilitate dogs labeled too dangerous or unfit, pairing them with children who had experienced trauma, loss, or silence of their own. The belief at the heart of the program was simple. When two broken spirits find one another, they do not stay broken. They mend each other. Mira would serve as the youth ambassador, sharing her story through schools, community centers, and children's hospitals. Blitz, now a legend, became the face of the movement. His profile used as the emblem on every training vest and every shelter flyer. Together, they would change not only the lives of dogs and children, but the very definition of what it meant to be damaged. That summer, on a quiet afternoon at the Foundation's first campus, a sanctuary nestled among trees, Mira sat on the grass, with Blitz's head resting on her lap. The wind stirred gently, carrying laughter from nearby therapy sessions. A young boy approached. He was small, maybe 6 years old, with a tremble in his step and eyes that darted between Mira and the hulking form of the German shepherd. Blitz did not move suddenly. He stood, slowly, walked halfway, and sat, still and patient, just watching. Mira nodded softly at the boy, smiling with a warmth that asked for nothing in return. The boy hesitated. Then, inch by inch, he reached out his hand. It shook as it hovered, then finally rested on Blitz's back. No words were spoken. None were needed. Mira watched, tears welling in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from a joy so full it could only exist in silence. Blitz let out a long sigh and leaned into the touch. This was no longer the dog that terrified a crowd from behind glass. This was the guardian of a child's first act of trust. And beside him, the girl who had once had nothing, now held a world of hope in her hands. If this story touched your heart, the bond between a silent girl and a so-called monster, and how love rewrote both their destinies, imagine how many more untold stories are out there, waiting to be heard. At Amazing Paws Stories, we bring you the most emotional, inspiring tales where animals and humans heal each other in ways the world never expects. If you believe in second chances, in loyalty without words, and in the quiet power of compassion, then please like, comment, and most of all, subscribe to Amazing Paws Stories, because every paw print has a story, and we are here to tell it. See you in the next story.
Picture this. You're standing alone in the stillness of an early morning forest. The mist hangs low, curling through the pines like soft ribbons. Birds are just beginning to stir, the air smells of damp earth, and every sound is sharp in the cool silence. Then, from somewhere deep among the trees, it comes a sound so strange it makes you freeze. Not a meow, not a growl, but a wild, rumbling roar that sounds like it escaped from the throat of a dinosaur. You can feel it in your chest, bouncing off the trunks, scattering the squirrels. And here's the twist. This mighty voice doesn't belong to a giant predator. It belongs to one of the forest's smallest, most elusive residents, a bobcat. In the next hour, you're going to meet this unexpected little character, discover why its voice could fill the forest with joy, and learn the real story of what happens when a human and a wildcat's worlds collide. This isn't just about a cute animal video. It's about companionship, wildlife rescue, and the lessons the wild has been whispering to us all along. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change the way you think about the animals we share our world with. The sun was still hiding behind the ridgeline when Luke Anderson stepped out of his camper van and felt the crisp bite of the Cascade Mountains' morning air. He zipped up his fleece jacket, a camera swinging lightly from its strap against his side. For Luke, this was the sweet spot of the day, the quiet hour, when the forest still held on to its secrets before the trails filled with hikers and the chatter of human voices washed over the woods. He had driven up from his home in Oregon the night before, chasing the first golds and reds of fall through Washington's high country. His goal wasn't just pretty landscapes. Luke was after something rarer, moments that told a deeper story about the creatures who called these slopes home. Years ago, he'd learned that patience wasn't just a photographer's tool, it was the bridge between himself and the wild. That morning, he moved slowly along a narrow pine needle path, careful not to disturb the frost-tipped undergrowth. The scent of damp earth and cedar drifted around him. His boots crunched softly over frozen leaves, and his breath curled in faint clouds. A Steller's jay darted overhead, scolding him with a sharp cry before vanishing into the mist. This was Luke's kind of solitude alive, with small sounds, each one an invitation to pay closer attention. Halfway down the trail, he crouched to adjust his tripod. That's when it happened, a faint rustle in the brush to his right. Nothing unusual at first. The cascades were full of squirrels, snowshoe hares, and the occasional curious deer. But then came a sound that didn't fit. Low and drawn out, it started like a growl, but rose into something stranger, almost like the comical echoing roar from a movie dinosaur. Luke froze, his pulse quickening. It wasn't loud enough to feel threatening, but it was so out of place it made his skin prickle. In all his years photographing wildlife, Luke had heard coyotes yipping in unison, elk bugling in the fog, even the hiss of a cougar's warning, but nothing like this. He stayed still, one hand tightening around his camera, the other instinctively pressing against the worn leather strap across his chest. That odd roar came again, closer this time, bouncing off the trees in a way that made it hard to pinpoint. Here's the thing, when you spend years in nature, you learn to separate background noise from true signals. The wind has a rhythm. Birds follow patterns, but when something breaks the pattern, like a bobcat roaring like a prehistoric creature, your instincts wake up fast. Luke slowly lowered himself to one knee, adjusting the zoom lens. The forest ahead was a shifting curtain of mist, light, and shadow. A squirrel dashed across a fallen log, tail twitching, but the sound didn't match its small frame. Then another rustle, heavier this time. His eyes scanned the tree line until they caught a flicker of movement, the tip of an ear tufted and alert just above the grass. The ear moved, followed by a pair of amber eyes. There, perched awkwardly on the mossy arch of a downed cedar, was a young bobcat. Its fur was dappled with faint spots, still in the awkward in-between of kitten and adult. And its mouth, wide open mid-call, sending out that bizarre, throaty dinosaur voice again. Luke's lips curled into a grin despite himself. This wasn't just another wildlife sighting. This was a story happening right in front of him. He pressed the shutter lightly, the muted click swallowed by the forest. The bobcat tilted its head almost as if it had heard him, then continued its strange performance, calling into the trees like it expected an answer. Luke recognized the look, a young wildcat testing its voice, maybe calling for a parent, maybe just practicing the sounds its instincts told it to make. And here's where the moment turned from amusing to unsettling. The little bobcat didn't seem nervous. It was far less cautious than Luke would have expected for a species known to vanish at the first hint of a human. He'd once spent 2 freezing hours crouched in snow just to get a blurry tail shot of one disappearing into the underbrush. But this one, it just stayed there, staring, vocalizing again and again, and no other bobcat answered. In the back of his mind, a quiet voice began to whisper possibilities. He'd read enough wildlife case studies to know that young animals found alone in the wild aren't always abandoned. Sometimes a mother will leave her young in a safe spot while she hunts. Sometimes she's nearby but unseen. But there were other harsher realities too. Predators, illness, accidents. In bobcats, as in lions, mortality for young can be heartbreakingly high. Studies show over half never reach adulthood, often lost in their first year to hunger, larger predators, or simply being too young to fend for themselves. Luke eased himself lower, resting on his heels. He didn't want to spook the animal or insert himself into a situation that nature might still resolve. That's one of the toughest lessons in wildlife rescue. The line between helping and harming isn't always clear. He'd once watched a park ranger refuse to move a fawn lying alone in tall grass, explaining that touching it might lead the mother to reject it. The fawn's mother returned hours later, proving his restraint right. Still, something about this bobcat didn't match that pattern. Minutes stretched into an hour. No movement in the surrounding forest. No adult is answering the strange calls. The bobcat, whom Luke hadn't yet named, hopped down from the log and paced in short, uncertain loops, returning each time to the same spot. It pawed at the damp earth, flicked its tail, then sat down and stared at him again. Luke glanced at the light creeping between the trees. His plan for the morning photographing migrating birds along the river bend was dissolving, replaced by the quiet weight of this encounter. He knew he could walk away. He could chalk it up to an odd wildlife moment, leave the bobcat to its fate, and maybe see the photo go viral under a funny wildcat baby headline. But that choice felt shallow, almost selfish. Because in that moment, Luke wasn't just a photographer. He was a witness to a life balanced on the thinnest edge. A life that might depend on whether someone noticed in time. The small lesson here was one Luke had learned long before he ever set foot in the Cascades. The forest doesn't revolve around us, but sometimes it hands us responsibility we didn't ask for. The choice isn't always about what's safest for the human, it's about what gives the animal the best chance to live the life it was meant for. He exhaled slowly, lowering his camera. The bobcat blinked at him, still and watchful. Somewhere deep inside, Luke felt that subtle shift, the moment when curiosity turns into commitment. He couldn't have said why, but he knew this encounter wasn't over. That's the fresh perspective he wanted to share. Sometimes the wild pulls you in with beauty or humor, but it keeps you there with something harder to name, a quiet sense that you're now part of the story. Luke stood brushing frost from his knees. The bobcat's ears flicked forward, tracking him. He gave a slow nod, not that it meant anything to the animal, and stepped carefully back toward the trail. His boots pressed soft patterns into the damp earth. The forest around him felt different now, like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. As he reached the bend where the pines grew close and shadowed, Luke paused. That strange roar rang out again, carrying through the trees. It was absurd and endearing all at once, the kind of sound that would make people laugh in disbelief if they heard it in a cute animal video. But to Luke, it was more than entertainment. It was a signal. He tightened his grip on the camera strap and started back toward the sound, the decision already made somewhere deep inside him. And that's where the real story began, not with the click of a shutter, but with the choice to follow a wild voice deeper into the forest. Luke stepped quietly, scanning ahead as if the forest itself were a page he could read. The sound came again, low, ragged, and oddly drawn out. It rose and dipped like someone trying to mimic an animal they'd never heard before. For a moment, he imagined an old movie projector in the woods, playing a dinosaur scene on loop. But the bobcat was no illusion. It was very real, and it was still calling. The young cat was balanced on a rotting log, now tail flicking in short bursts. Its mouth opened in that strange raw throat, working harder than the sound seemed to justify. Luke lowered himself onto one knee, lens focused. The moment he pressed the shutter, the bobcat stopped mid-call, head turning toward him as though caught in the middle of telling a joke. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then it called again, louder, sharper, almost defiant. Luke had photographed bobcats before, but always from a distance and always in silence. Most bobcats, especially in North America, prefer to live in the margins, avoiding humans, slipping between shadows. Their calls are usually short yowls or screeches during mating season, not this theatrical rolling growl. Luke whispered into his mic recorder, "Juvenile, maybe 5 months." Vocalizing like nothing I've heard in the field before. Here's the clear explanation. Juvenile bobcats sometimes produce practice calls, vocalizations that sound odd or mismatched because the muscles and instincts behind them are still developing. In the wild, these calls can serve multiple purposes, reaching out to a parent, establishing presence, or simply testing their voice in the territory. But hearing it so openly, so close, was rare. Luke remembered an older colleague who'd spent a winter tracking a mother bobcat and her litter in the Blue Mountains. He'd recorded the kitten's awkward, almost comical attempts at growling sounds that startled magpies more than any potential prey. "It's like teenagers trying to sound tough," the man had laughed, but the voice cracks give them away. Watching Rusty, though, Luke hadn't yet named him, felt like watching that memory come to life. The bobcat paced, called, then paused to glance around as if expecting applause. And yet, behind the humor, there was something else, a rhythm to the pacing, a deliberate return to the same spot each time, as if it were calling from a place of routine. Luke knew that in the animal rescue world, behavior often tells the story faster than any physical exam. A confident, mobile juvenile with a strong voice should have a territory to explore and a mother nearby. But this one seemed anchored, unwilling to stray far from the log. The longer Luke watched, the more he sensed that the calls weren't just practice. They might be unanswered messages. What makes us laugh in nature can also be a sign of something serious. We're wired to react to the cute or funny. A kitten tripping over its paws, a young wildcat trying on a grown-up roar. But often those same moments carry signals about an animal's health, safety, or environment. Luke kept filming, adjusting the frame to catch each call and pause. In the background, the forest went still between roars, as if the trees were listening too. That stillness was telling. In healthy bobcat territory, other sounds, bird chatter, squirrel alarms, fill the space. Silence can mean a predator is nearby, or it can mean the regular patterns have been disrupted. The call wasn't just a quirky sound to drop into a cute animal video. It was a language. In that language, a lone juvenile repeating a call without response could mean separation loss or disorientation. It was the kind of pattern wildlife researchers map carefully because it can point to environmental issues, reduced prey, shrinking habitat, or the aftershocks of human encroachment. Luke's mind flicked to the number of bobcat encounters reported in Washington's Cascades over the past decade, fewer than in the 90s, and many closer to human settlements. Habitat pressure changes behavior. Animals that once kept to deep cover might wander closer to roads, trails, or campgrounds simply because there's nowhere else to go. He took a slow step forward, careful to keep a fallen branch between himself and the bobcat. The cat turned a body tensing but didn't bolt. That in itself was strange. Most wild bobcats would vanish at the hint of an approach. Luke whispered, "You're not afraid of me." "Why?" This was where the mystery deepened. A bobcat comfortable in human presence could mean it had been orphaned and forced to scavenge closer to campsites, or worse, that someone had tried to raise it before abandoning it. In animal rescue cases, those humanized behaviors are dangerous for the animal and for people. An unafraid predator is more likely to approach the wrong yard, cross the wrong road, or fail in the wild. Luke stopped 5 yards away, crouching again. The bobcat's eyes tracked him without aggression, only curiosity. It tilted its head, gave one last dinosaur roar, and hopped down from the log to disappear behind a curtain of sword ferns. For a moment, Luke thought that was it. Encounter over. But then he caught the flick of a tail just ahead on the trail. The bobcat was walking away slowly, glancing back every few steps, not fleeing, but leading. This reminded Luke of a rescue story he'd filmed in Wyoming years ago. A young fox found alone near a hiking trail had led volunteers to the hollow log where its injured sibling lay hidden. They'd been able to bring both to a rehabilitation center and months later release them back into the wild. That fox had looked over its shoulder in the same way, as if inviting help without knowing it. Luke followed at a distance. The bobcat moved with a mix of grace and clumsiness, its oversized paws catching on roots, its tail flicking at passing leaves. Every so often it'd pause to call again, the sound rattling through the air. Luke recorded each one, knowing that later, these clips could be more than wildlife footage. They could be data points for understanding juvenile vocal behavior. By the time they reached a small clearing, Luke was certain this wasn't random. The bobcat circled twice, then sat in the center, looking straight at him. The calls stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Luke stayed on the edge of the clearing, hands resting on his knees. His breath came slow, his voice low. "You're telling me something, aren't you?" And maybe it was. Or maybe Luke was reading his sense of responsibility into the moment. Either way, he couldn't shake the feeling that walking away would mean leaving the story and the animal unfinished. The bobcat blinked, turned once more, and slipped into the trees. This time it didn't look back. Luke stayed there, letting the forest sounds return: a distant woodpecker, the rustle of wind in the canopy, the trill of a winter wren. The bobcat's strange roar was gone, but it had left an imprint not just on his camera's memory card, but on the part of him that had come to the Cascades for beauty and found a mystery instead. The small, quiet lesson here was about curiosity with purpose. It's one thing to chase the unusual for the sake of novelty. It's another to recognize when the unusual might be a signpost pointing towards something that needs attention. In wildlife rescue, that attention can mean the difference between a funny memory and a second chance at life. Luke straightened, adjusted the strap on his camera, and started back toward camp. He told himself he was leaving it there, but even as he walked, he kept listening for that odd roar. And when it came, faint but unmistakable from somewhere deeper in the forest, he didn't hesitate. He turned toward it. What Luke found next wasn't just another call, it was the first sign that the bobcat's story might not have a simple happy ending. Luke slowed his steps, scanning the dense undergrowth where the bobcat had vanished. He'd seen enough in his years outdoors to know that most young wildcats are never truly alone. Their mothers keep watch from somewhere nearby, silent and unseen. But with this one, something felt different. The calls were steady but unanswered. The movements were hesitant, as though it wasn't sure where to go next. He crouched behind a fallen cedar, letting the forest settle. A chipmunk darted past his boot, chattering an alarm, then vanished. Minutes passed, but no adult bobcat appeared. Here's the truth that's harder to accept in nature. Being alone doesn't always mean being abandoned, but sometimes it does. In the case of bobcats and even their bigger cousins, lions, there are several reasons a young cat might be left on its own. Some are temporary. The mother may be out hunting, leaving the young in what she believes is a safe spot. Others are final. She may have been killed by a predator, struck by a vehicle, or succumbed to illness. Luke had learned these patterns from rangers and rescue workers over the years. Predators like coyotes, mountain lions, and even large birds of prey can target young bobcats. Disease too takes its toll: feline distemper, parasites, infections. And there's the silent killer, starvation, when a mother can't bring enough food back to sustain her litter. Studies show that in the wild, as many as 50–70% of bobcat kittens never make it to their first year. Most of those losses happen in the first few months of life. The weight of those numbers settled in Luke's mind as he watched the clearing. He thought back to a winter in Idaho when he'd photographed a fox den for a magazine. The vixen left her kits for hours at a time while she hunted, returning with small rodents in her jaws. They'd yelp and tumble over each other to eat. One afternoon, she didn't come back. Days later, rangers found her body near a road. By the time help reached the den, only one kit remained alive. That survivor was taken to a wildlife rescue, and months later, Luke was there when they released it back into the wild. It had bolted into the snow like a shot free again, but it had needed human help to get there. Watching this young bobcat now, Luke felt the same knot in his chest. The sound it made, that strange dinosaur roar, had gone from funny to worrying. If no one answered soon, the forest would. And the forest for a lone juvenile was rarely kind. Nature is both beautiful and brutal. Not every animal found alone needs saving, but waiting too long to act can turn a survivable situation into a fatal one. That's the razor edge every wildlife rescuer has to walk, the balance between trusting nature and knowing when to intervene. Luke adjusted his pack, pulling out a water bottle and taking a slow sip. The bobcat reappeared at the far edge of the clearing, ears pricked, eyes scanning. It moved closer, pausing every few steps to look around as if expecting someone or something to step out of the shadows. Many people assume that finding a young wild animal alone is a clear sign it's been abandoned. But in most cases, especially with mammals, the parent is close. Intervening too soon can disrupt that natural care. On the other hand, repeated signs, weakness visible in injury, unusual tameness, or persistent calling without response can indicate real trouble. That's when the best course is to contact a licensed wildlife rescue center. They have the training to assess, treat, and when possible, return the animal to the wild. Luke knew all of this. He'd even spoken in workshops about it, showing slides of rescue animals from tiny screech owls to fawns and explaining the do's and don'ts of public intervention. And yet, standing there with this young bobcat just yards away, theory felt far away. This wasn't a textbook scenario. This was a living, breathing creature, and the choice was his. The bobcat circled a patch of grass, lay down, then sat up again. Its tail twitched in short, restless flicks. Every so often it turned its face toward Luke as if acknowledging his presence. He thought of a case in Montana where a juvenile bobcat had been taken in by hikers who thought it was abandoned. The truth was, the mother had been just out of sight. By the time the young cat reached a rescue facility, it had imprinted on humans and could no longer be released safely into the wild. It spent the rest of its life in captivity. That story haunted Luke because the hikers had acted out of kindness, but without the right knowledge, kindness can have unintended consequences. The young bobcat called again, the sound echoing into the trees. Still no answer. Luke's fingers tightened around his camera strap. The forest had a rhythm, and right now, something in that rhythm felt broken. He reached into his pack, pulled out his phone, and scrolled to Claire Matthews' contact. Claire was a wildlife veterinarian and a friend from a past project. If anyone could help him decide, it was her. He hit call. "Luke," she answered, her voice alert despite the early hour. "Claire, I've got a juvenile bobcat here, maybe 5 months old. Alone. Been calling for over an hour. No adult in sight." She didn't hesitate. "Don't touch it yet. Could be the mother's nearby. I've thought of that. But it's not acting like a wildcat should." A pause, then. "You might be right. But if you intervene, you own that choice and the consequences. You know the law here. No permits, no possession. Legal penalties for taking wildlife into one's care without authorization could mean fines, confiscation, or even charges." Luke knew that. Claire reminded him anyway. "Let me make some calls," she said. "If we get a rehab center lined up, we can do this right. But if you move now without that, you're stepping into risky ground." He ended the call and looked back toward the clearing. The bobcat was lying down again, head resting on its paws. It looked small, suddenly, the humor of its strange roar replaced by a quiet vulnerability. Wild animals aren't just props for cute animal videos or rescue stories. Each one has a place in an ecosystem, a role that goes beyond our emotional connection. Helping them means more than feeding or sheltering. It means giving them the chance to remain what they are: wild. Luke took a deep breath, weighing his options. The forest whispered around him, 1,000 small lives moving unseen. He could walk away and hope the mother returned. He could stay and watch longer, or he could act now, risking the law, but possibly saving the animal. He reached for his pack, sliding the zipper shut. The decision was coming whether he was ready or not. Luke stayed in the clearing longer than he should have. The bobcat hadn't moved far, still within sight, still quiet except for an occasional twitch of its ears. His phone felt heavier in his pocket after that call with Claire. She'd made it clear the safest route was to wait for official help, but that could take hours. Out here, hours could mean the difference between life and death for a young wildcat. He took a slow step forward. The bobcat lifted its head, eyes locking on him. No fear, no retreat, just curiosity. That lack of fear made Luke's stomach tighten. In the wildlife rescue world, too, tame wasn't a compliment. It was a warning sign. A predator that's lost its natural caution is already in trouble. Laws across the U.S., including in Washington, prohibit the possession or transport of native wildlife without permits. The reason isn't just control, it's protection. Wild animals carry diseases, need specialized care, and can become dangerous as they grow. Rehabilitation requires quarantine medical checks and a controlled reintroduction to the wild, none of which can happen in a private home without proper licensing. Luke knew all of this. He'd told others the same in photography workshops. Admire the wild from a distance, help through the right channels. But as he watched the bobcat, he felt that quiet shift again from observer to participant. He moved, slowly lowering himself so he wouldn't tower over it. "Easy, little one," he murmured. The bobcat tilted its head, whiskers twitching. Luke extended his hand halfway, not to touch, but to test the cat's reaction. It stayed still. That was the moment the invisible line was crossed. Luke remembered filming in Arizona years ago when hikers brought a juvenile raccoon to a visitor center. They'd carried it in a backpack, proud of rescuing it. The staff had to explain the fines they faced, and that the raccoon would be quarantined for months before release, if release was even possible. The hikers had meant well, but in taking it, they'd also taken away its natural learning time with its mother. Luke didn't want to make that mistake. But what if the mother wasn't coming back? What if the bobcat was already too far gone down the road of human dependence? He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the decision. The small lesson here was about responsibility when rules meet reality. Laws are there for a reason to protect both humans and wildlife, but in the field, decisions aren't always black and white. Sometimes the choice isn't between right and wrong. It's between two risks, each with its own cost. Luke opened his pack and pulled out a spare flannel shirt. Moving gently, he stepped closer until he was just within reach. The bobcat's eyes followed his every move. In one careful motion, he draped the shirt over its back, scooping it up without giving it time to panic. It squirmed once, then went still, pressed against his chest. Its body was lighter than he expected, ribs faint under the fur. He could feel the tremor of its breath. "Got you," he whispered the words more for himself than the cat. Breaking a rule doesn't always come from disregard. Sometimes it comes from urgency, empathy, or the belief that your action is the lesser harm. But that belief needs to be backed by a plan. Without the right next steps, good intentions can unravel into long-term damage. Luke tucked the bobcat into a corner of his pack, leaving the zipper open so it could breathe. He lined the inside with the flannel both for warmth and to shield it from view. The decision was made now. There was no undoing it. He would take it to his camper, keep it safe, and work with Claire to find a rehabilitation center. He walked back along the trail, scanning for other hikers. The last thing he needed was someone seeing him with a wildcat in his pack. At the van, he set the pack gently on the passenger seat, then started the engine. His hands tightened on the wheel, not from fear of the bobcat, but from the knowledge that every mile forward was a step deeper into a gray area he'd always told himself to avoid. As he drove toward the small town at the base of the mountains, the bobcat shifted inside the pack, pushing its head against the open zipper. Luke glanced over. Its eyes were open wider now, ears swiveling toward the road sounds. There was no aggression, only a strange trust that made Luke uneasy. He pulled into a feed store, telling the clerk he was picking up supplies for a rescued kitten. He bought kitten formula, a small animal crate, and blankets. The clerk didn't ask questions. Back at the van, Luke transferred the bobcat into the crate, covering it with a towel to block the view. On the drive, Claire called back. "Did you move it?" she asked. "I have it with me," Luke admitted. A long pause. "Then you need to understand you're now responsible for everything that happens next. And if you get caught with it before we place it, you could face fines or worse." "I understand," Luke said, though his voice carried the strain. "Just help me get it to the right place." Her voice softened. "I will. But Luke, this isn't a pet. Remember that." He drove on in silence, replaying her words. Not a pet. That line was easy to say, harder to live by when the animal in question was looking at you like you were its entire world. In wildlife rescue, the emotional pull is real, but so are the boundaries. Compassion isn't just about doing something. It's about doing it in a way that doesn't compromise the animal's chance to be what it is: wild. By the time Luke reached his cabin near the Columbia River, the bobcat had curled into a corner of the crate, eyes half shut. He set the crate in a quiet corner, placed a shallow dish of formula nearby, and sat on the floor a few feet away. It didn't eat, but it didn't shy away either. Luke knew this was the start of something complicated. He was no longer just a man with a camera in the woods. He was now part of this animal's story, and every choice from here on would shape its ending. And in the days that followed, as the bobcat began to trust him, Luke would learn that saving a wild animal is nothing like keeping a pet, and that the wild has a way of reminding you where the real boundaries are. Luke didn't name the bobcat right away. For the first couple of days, it was simply him or the little guy. But by the third morning, as the young cat sat in the corner of his cabin's small sunroom and let out another one of those guttural, comically deep roars, Luke chuckled and said, "All right, Rusty. That's enough." The name stuck. He began structuring his days around Rusty. Feedings came every 4 hours, formula warmed just enough poured into a shallow dish, then later offered from a small bottle when Rusty learned to take it without clawing at the sides. Luke kept notes on a yellow pad, ounces consumed times fed whether Rusty seemed restless or calm. It was the same kind of record-keeping wildlife rehabbers used, though Luke knew he was still operating outside the proper system. Young bobcats, like many wildcat species, require a steady feeding schedule to grow. In the wild, the mother's hunting success determines survival. In human care, formula gradually transitions to soft solids. In this case, Luke used finely ground meat mixed with formula, then eventually small strips of raw rabbit from a local farm supply. These shifts mimic what would happen naturally as a mother introduces her young to meat. Rusty's dinosaur voice became part of the daily routine. Sometimes it was a greeting when Luke entered the room, other times a protest if food wasn't ready fast enough. Once when Luke played a recording of wild bobcat calls on his phone, Rusty paused mid-bite and answered with his signature roar, then looked at Luke as if to say, "See, I'm one of them too." Luke remembered a wildlife center in Colorado where he'd filmed orphaned cougar cubs. The staff would play recorded cougar calls during feeding to keep the cubs connected to their species' sounds. It helped prevent them from identifying too closely with humans. With Rusty, Luke knew that the boundary was already blurring. The young cat followed him from room to room, sat beside him when he worked at his desk, and even pawed gently at his leg when he wanted attention. The small lesson here was that attachment works both ways. Luke was giving Rusty the care he needed to survive, but Rusty was giving Luke something too, a sense of companionship that went beyond curiosity or novelty. For someone used to being alone in the field days on end without speaking, the soft weight of Rusty curling against his side in the evenings felt like an anchor. Every moment Rusty spent seeing Luke as his world was another moment he wasn't learning to be a wild bobcat. In the wild, play teaches young cats to hunt, to read body language, and to respect boundaries. With no littermates, Rusty's training came in the form of chasing rolled-up socks across the floor, pouncing on Luke's bootlaces and ambushing him from behind the couch. These games started as harmless fun. Luke even filmed short clips, Rusty stalking a toy mouse, Rusty splashing in a shallow pan of water, Rusty mid-roar with ears flattened in mock ferocity. They would have been perfect for cute animal videos online, the kind of people who share without thinking about the backstory. But Luke didn't post them. Something told him this was not a story to share yet. Some moments made him pause. One afternoon, Rusty leapt for a dangling camera strap and caught Luke's forearm instead. The claws didn't go deep, but the swipe was strong, far stronger than a house cat's. Luke cleaned the scratch, brushed it off, but a quiet thought lingered. This was a predator in the making. He thought back to a case in Alaska where a man had tried to raise an orphaned lynx kitten. It had been playful and sweet until it reached adolescence. Then, without warning, a rough game left the man with stitches in his hand and the realization that the animal couldn't stay. The lynx went to a sanctuary, but its years with humans meant it would never live wild again. Luke tried to adjust Rusty's environment. He set up climbing shelves in the sunroom, brought in logs for scratching, and hid treats to encourage foraging behavior. Rusty adapted quickly, finding every hidden piece of food leaping between shelves with increasing grace. Yet he still returned to Luke's side each evening, purring softly, in a way bobcats rarely do in the wild. The small lesson here was about the fine line between rescue and domestication. Helping an animal survive isn't just about feeding it, it's about preparing it for a life without you. Every human comfort you add can be a hurdle later. Still, there were moments Luke couldn't help but cherish. Bath time became a comedy routine. Rusty would splash paw at the water and then shake droplets all over the room, looking almost smug about it. His eyes seemed brighter each week, his steps more confident. He'd grown heavier, his muscles firming under his spotted coat. Claire visited after 3 weeks. She knelt by the crate watching Rusty eat. "He's thriving," she said, "but Luke, you know this can't last." "I know," he replied, though his voice was quieter than he intended. "You need to start thinking about where he goes from here. The longer he's with you, the harder it'll be for him to adapt." Luke nodded but didn't commit to anything that day. That night, Rusty crawled into Luke's lap and fell asleep, his small body rising and falling with steady breaths. Luke sat still, feeling the warmth seep into him. He wondered if Rusty felt the same, that sense of safety, of belonging. The bond between humans and animals can be profound even with wild species. But in wildlife rescue, the strength of that bond can be both a gift and a danger. It can motivate you to do everything in your power to protect them, but it can also make it harder to give them back the freedom they were born with. Weeks passed, and Rusty's playful ambushes grew more forceful. Once when Luke came in from the yard, Rusty launched from a chair, wrapping his front legs around Luke's arm. The grip was firm enough to make Luke gasp. He pried the cat off, gently scratching behind his ears to calm him. Rusty purred, unaware that he'd just confirmed what Claire had been warning: he was becoming too strong for these games. Luke began noticing other changes. Rusty would crouch low, tail-flicking eyes locked on the sparrows at the feeder outside. His body language had shifted, less kitten, more hunter. The instincts were still there, waiting. One evening, as Luke sat at his desk editing photos, Rusty jumped up and pawed at the screen, eyes following the movement in a video of a wild bobcat stalking through snow. Luke smiled, but his chest tightened. It was a reminder, no matter how many nights they'd spent together, Rusty's place was not here. And it wouldn't be long before the forest and Luke's conscience would force him to face that truth head-on. It started one quiet morning in late October. Luke was pouring coffee when Rusty leapt from the top of the bookshelf and landed squarely on his shoulder. The claws dug through flannel, pricking skin. Luke steadied himself, pried the bobcat loose, and set it down. Gently. Rusty gave a little chuff. Not an apology, not affection, just a sound that said he'd been practicing something new. Luke flexed his shoulder, feeling the faint sting. He'd been expecting this moment. In the wild, young bobcats start honing their hunting skills as early as 4 months old. By Rusty's age, they're pouncing on live prey, testing their strength against siblings in rough play, learning the distance between safe and dangerous. Without siblings, Luke had become the stand-in. Predators develop through instinctive play. Wrestling, ambushing, chasing, these are the drills that sharpen their claws and reflexes. In a home, that same play can become dangerous as the animal grows. Even a swipe meant in fun can break skin, and a playful bite can crush small bones. The bigger problem: a human can't teach the rules of a predator's world. Only another predator can. Luke remembered filming at a rehabilitation center in Wyoming. 2 orphaned bobcats had been paired together in a large outdoor enclosure. Staff would drop live crickets and mice into the space to stimulate hunting. At first, the cats fumbled, more curious than lethal. Weeks later, they moved with synchronized precision, one distracting while the other pounced. They teach each other, the lead rehabber had told him. You can't replicate that. With Rusty, Luke had tried to mimic those challenges, hiding food, creating climbing routes, but every game led back to him. When Rusty crouched in the hallway and sprang, Luke was the target. At first, it was endearing. Now the pounces had weight. The claws hooked and held. The dinosaur roar was deeper edged with something less playful. No matter how much care you give a wild animal's, instincts will always emerge. You can't love those instincts away, and you shouldn't try. They're what the animal will need to survive when you're gone. One afternoon, Luke sat on the porch editing photos while Rusty roamed the fenced yard. A pair of crows landed nearby. Rusty flattened himself, muscles taut. In one fluid motion, he sprang halfway up the fence, swiping at the birds as they cawed and scattered. Luke had seen that same move in the wild, the economy of energy. The burst of speed, the precision. Rusty paced afterward, tail lashing. It was no longer the pacing of a restless kitten. It was the measure of a hunter. The more successful the rescue in terms of health and growth, the faster the day comes when the rescuer is no longer the safest place for the animal. It's an irony in wildlife rescue: your best work brings you closer to goodbye. That evening, while Luke was preparing Rusty's meal, the bobcat slipped in behind him and launched at his calf. Luke staggered, catching himself on the counter. Rusty didn't break skin, but the strength of the grip startled him. He turned, locking eyes with the cat. Rusty's ears were forward, body loose, no malice, just instinct. But Luke felt the truth settle in. This couldn't go on. He thought back to a cougar cub he'd photographed at a sanctuary in Montana. The cub had been raised by people after its mother was killed by a poacher. It played like a dog, sought out petting, but by 9 months old it was powerful enough to injure someone without meaning to. The sanctuary kept it in a large enclosure, safe but never free. "We can give them a life," the caretaker had said, "but not the life they were born for." Claire stopped by the next morning to check on Rusty. She stood in the sunroom watching him stalk a rope toy. "He's grown," she said, "and he's quick now." "Too quick," Luke admitted. She looked at him. "It's time to talk about the next step." Luke's chest tightened. "You mean letting him go?" "I mean giving him a chance to be a bobcat. There's a reserve 2 hours east. They take juveniles, pair them with others, and teach them to hunt. He could have a real shot there. And if I say no, then he'll grow up here. And sooner or later, that ends badly for him, for you, maybe both." The conversation hung in the air after she left. Luke sat in the sunroom with Rusty curled near his feet, the warmth of the cat's body a comfort he wasn't ready to lose. Yet every flick of the tail, every alert turn of the ears was a reminder of the predator inside. The hardest part of caring for a wild animal isn't the feeding schedules, the mess, or even the risk of injury. It's knowing when your presence is no longer helping, when holding on becomes the thing that stands in the way of their future. That night, Luke lay in bed listening to the forest outside. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. In the crate beside his bed, Rusty stirred, gave a low growl, and settled again. Luke knew the growl wasn't for him. It was for the owl, for the night, for the wild that still lived in his bones. The frost had deepened over the Cascades by the time Luke confirmed the transfer. Claire had spoken with a licensed wildlife rehabilitation center in eastern Washington, a facility with open enclosures, hunting training, and a program specifically for juvenile bobcats. They could take Rusty within the week. Luke agreed, but each day afterward felt like both a countdown and a reprieve. Mornings were the hardest. Rusty would trot to greet him, letting out his signature dinosaur roar, and Luke would feel the decision buckle inside him. Then he'd catch sight of the lean muscle under Rusty's coat, the sharper edge to his play, and remember why this had to happen. Releasing a young predator into the wild is rarely as simple as opening a gate. The best wildlife rescue programs work in stages quarantined to ensure no disease pairing with other juveniles, to encourage species-specific behavior and gradual exposure to live prey, so hunting skills develop naturally. Without these steps, a release can be fatal within days. Claire reminded him of this when she stopped by midweek. "If you keep him here," she said, "you're giving him comfort. If you send him there, you're giving him a future." Luke knew she was right. He'd seen it before, years ago, at a wildlife reserve in Montana, where 2 orphaned lynx were introduced into a large snow-covered enclosure. At first, they lingered near the gate, hesitant. Weeks later, they were chasing snowshoe hares through the drifts, their movements fluid and confident. The difference wasn't just survival. It was the transformation from dependent to independent. Love in wildlife rescue isn't about keeping. It's about letting go at the right time so the animal can live the life it was built for. Luke began preparing Rusty for the trip. He placed the old flannel shirt, the one he'd wrapped Rusty in that first day, inside the transport crate so it would carry a familiar scent. He moved the crate into the sunroom days before letting Rusty explore it so it wouldn't feel like a trap. Each time the young bobcat stepped inside, Luke's chest tightened. The night before the transfer, Luke sat on the floor beside the crate, watching Rusty sleep. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in long, low sighs. He thought about all the moments they'd shared, the first time Rusty ate from his hand, the splash of bath time, the purr-like chuffs during evening quiet. The cabin would feel different without that presence. In human relationships, goodbye can sometimes be softened with promises, letters, visits, calls. In wildlife rescue, goodbye means surrendering control entirely. You have to trust that others will carry the work forward, that the animal will adapt, and that your absence will ultimately serve its best interest. The morning came cold and bright. Luke carried Rusty to the van, the crate lined with blankets, a towel draped over the top to keep him calm. Rusty shifted inside but didn't call out. Claire met him at the driveway, her truck idling. They drove in convoy, the miles unspooling in silence. At the center, staff greeted them warmly but with the brisk efficiency of people who work at the seam between life and death daily. They led Luke to a quiet intake area where Rusty's crate was set beside a door leading to the quarantine wing. Luke crouched in front of the crate. Rusty pressed his nose to the bars, eyes bright and steady. Luke slid his fingers through for one last touch. "You're going to be all right," he said softly. "Better than all right." The lead rehabber told Luke about a bobcat they'd released the previous spring. It had been found near Spokane alone, and underweight, much like Rusty. After months in the program, it was fitted with a tracking collar and released into the forested hills. 6 months later, the collar data showed it was hunting successfully and maintaining territory. "It's what we want for all of them," the rehabber said. Luke nodded, though the words felt heavy. He stepped back as they carried the crate through the door. Rusty's head turned once, and Luke caught his reflection in those gold eyes. Then the door closed. The small lesson here was that sometimes the most loving act is also the most painful. The measure of success in wildlife rescue isn't how long the animal stays with you, it's whether it can thrive without you. Outside, the air felt sharper. Luke stood by the van, hands deep in his jacket pockets. Claire joined him, her voice low. "He's in good hands. You did right by him." "Doesn't feel like it," Luke admitted. "It will," she said. "Give it time." The drive home was long. The cabin felt larger, the silence inside stretching into the corners. Luke caught himself glancing toward the sunroom, expecting to see Rusty curled in a patch of light. Instead, there was just the empty crate folded and set aside. Letting go doesn't erase the bond, it transforms it. You carry it forward, not as a loss, but as proof that your care had a purpose beyond your comfort. That night, Luke sat on the porch under a sky bright with stars. Somewhere hours away, Rusty was beginning a new chapter. Luke imagined him exploring a larger space, meeting another bobcat for the first time, testing his muscles on a proper hunt. The thought steadied him. Weeks would pass before Luke knew whether Rusty was adapting, and when the update finally came, it would bring a mix of relief, pride, and something even more unexpected. Winter had turned to spring twice since Luke last saw Rusty. The seasons in the Cascades came and went like pages in a book, each one missing a familiar chapter. He still caught himself listening for that strange guttural roar whenever he walked the forest trails, the sound that had first pulled him into this story. Claire's updates came in short bursts over the months. First, Rusty was eating well and showing interest in live prey during training. Then he was paired with a slightly older female, and together they'd begun stalking birds in the rehab enclosure. Eventually, she told Luke that the staff had stopped hand-feeding him entirely. Rusty was catching everything he ate. Each report was a quiet reassurance that the wild was taking hold. A successful wildlife rescue is measured in independence. The goal isn't to tame, but to restore. Every milestone Rusty hit hunting, socializing with other bobcats, avoiding human contact, was a step toward a release that would give him the life he was meant for. When the call finally came that Rusty was ready for release, Luke made the drive east. The center's release site was miles from any human settlement, tucked in rolling forest with streams and thick underbrush. He stood with the rehab team as they opened the transport crate. Rusty stepped out slowly, his head turning toward the trees. There was no hesitation once he saw the open ground ahead. He moved forward in a low, confident trot, pausing only once to glance back. Luke raised his camera but didn't take the shot. Some moments he knew were meant to be lived, not captured. Luke thought about the bobcat the rehabber had told him about the year before, the one released near Spokane, tracked for months as it established territory and thrived. That story had given him hope during the long wait, and now he was seeing Rusty step into his version of it. The lesson here was simple but hard-earned. Letting go isn't the end of the bond. It's trusting that what you gave, the care, the time, the protection, will carry forward, even when you're not there. In the weeks after Rusty's release, Luke found himself returning to the same places they'd shared. He'd walked the trail where he first heard that dinosaur roar stop by the clearing where Rusty had sat calling into the trees. There was no sign of him, of course. That was the point. The wild doesn't leave souvenirs for you to collect. He began speaking more openly about the experience. Photography workshops showing not just his pictures, but the process, the risks of keeping wild animals, the importance of legal wildlife rescue, and the way human attachment can complicate an animal's chance at survival. Many people see wildlife rescue through the lens of cute animal videos and emotional reunions. The real work is quieter, longer, and often ends without a reunion at all. Success means the animal no longer needs you, and that's a truth both humbling and freeing. Luke also found that Rusty's story changed the way he approached his work. He spent more time documenting conservation efforts, highlighting the people and places that make wild survival possible. In doing so, he realized that photography could be more than art. It could be advocacy. Each image could carry a piece of the wild into someone else's awareness. He shared Rusty's journey at a community event, careful to keep details focused on the broader message. Respect for wildlife, the balance between compassion and caution, and the role each person can play in protecting habitats. The audience asked if he thought Rusty remembered him. Luke smiled. Maybe, but it's more important that he remembers how to be a bobcat. The knowledge he passed on came from lived experience. Wild animals are not pets, no matter how small they start. Legal licensed rescue gives them the best chance at freedom. Intervening without understanding the full picture can do more harm than good. Letting go is part of the rescue, not a failure of it. One crisp morning the following fall, Luke was walking a ridge trail when he heard a faint, familiar roar from somewhere deep in the valley. He stopped listening. It might have been another bobcat. It might have been Rusty. He didn't need to know for sure. The sound was enough. For Luke, that moment was the quiet closing of a circle. Rusty was out there living the life the forest had shaped for him, and Luke had done his part to make that possible. The forest felt fuller somehow, not because Rusty was nearby, but because Luke knew the wild still had its voice. As you think about Rusty's story, ask yourself, where in your own life are you holding on when it might be time to let go? What would it mean to give someone or something the freedom to be what they were meant to be? If this journey touched you, if it made you smile at the thought of a bobcat with a dinosaur voice filling the forest with joy, I invite you to like this video. Subscribe for more stories of rescue animals and wildlife rescue, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that real love sometimes means setting them free.